Good evening. I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and on behalf of the entire staff, thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the cold and the ice. Just a few quick administrative notes. Now would be a good time to turn off your cell phones or anything that might go beep during the talk. When we get to the Q&A session, we'd appreciate it if you'd step up to this microphone if you have a question, because we are recording the event tonight, both for our purposes and also C-SPAN Book TV is here. And at the end, before you come up to have your book signed, our staff would appreciate it if you would fold up the chairs that you're seated in and lean them against something solid somewhere. And now for this evening's feature presentation, it always makes our hosting job here a little easier when on the day the author is due to appear, the Washington Post style section decides to run a big favorable feature about the person and the new book. And that, of course, is what happened today for Congressman Steve Israel. For those of you who haven't read the Post piece yet, let me summarize.
No, read the whole thing.
Steve, in his first attempt at a novel, has written a really, really funny Washington parody titled The Global War on Morris. The story recounts how the U.S. government's giant counterterrorism apparatus gets focused on a hapless Long Island pharmaceutical salesman named Morris. Morris, is it Felstein or Felstein? However you want to put it. Anyway, Morris. What seems to amaze even some of Steve's closest friends isn't how amusing the book turned out. It's how he found time to write it. For one thing, he represents a pretty demanding and far from a securely Democratic district, New York's 3rd congressional district, which includes a chunk of Long Island as well as a small portion of Queens. Also, having served in Congress for 14 years, he's become a ranking member of the House Democratic leadership and has twice chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. But Steve does enjoy writing and apparently has developed a knack for doing so on his cell phone, which is where he composed a good part of the book. Why a comic novel? Well, as he told the Washington Post, instead of screaming and yelling on the floor of the House when confronted by the insanity of Washington, he prefers to deal with it as parody. And we're all the more fortunate as a result. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Congressman Steve Israel.
Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Let's hear it for Brad and the entire staff at Politics and Prose. You know, there's this theory around the country that good old independent bookstores are a thing of the past. You come here at Politics and Prose and you realize they are not a thing of the past. They're just glorious. So thank you to Politics and Prose. Now, as a good congressman representing New York's 3rd congressional district, I should also put in a plug for the Book Review, my local independent bookstore. I was there Monday night. I love independent bookstores, and I'm really honored that you would allow me to come in and visit with you. Is it Feldstein or Feldstein? I mean, you say Feldstein, I say Feldstein. However you want to interpret it, it's a good old Morris. The book is about Morris, and what I thought we would do is spend 5 minutes sharing with you what inspired the book, and then do 3 short 5-minute readings to give you some context, to introduce you to some characters, and then we'll open it up to whatever you want. We'll have a conversation. Happy to answer any questions that you have. I have many old friends and new friends here tonight. My oldest friends know that when I was growing up in Levittown, New York, America's first suburb, I wanted to do 3 things with my life. 3 things. Number 1, I wanted to be a congressman. Number 2, I wanted to be an author. Number 3, I wanted to play center field for the New York Mets. since I was horrible at baseball, I was able to focus on serving in Congress and writing this book. So those two passions of mine converged. Let me tell you what inspired the book and how it was written. I was elected in 2000, and one of the first major issues that I had to confront after 9/11 was the Bush administration's argument that we needed to take military action in Iraq. So here I was, a new member of Congress, who until that point, my idea of a top secret meeting with a major official was sitting down with the highway superintendent in Huntington, New York, to discuss paving strategies. And now I'm in these meetings, Brad, with the President of the United States, George Bush, and the Vice President of the United States, and Colin Powell, and Condi Rice, and Donald Rumsfeld, and listening to their arguments as to why we needed to go to war in Iraq. Now, when you are a new member of Congress, everything's done on the basis of seniority. We all know that. You know, when you speak is determined by your seniority. What committees you sit on is determined by seniorities. Even where you sit is determined by seniority. And so at these meetings, because I was the lowest on the totem pole, the most junior member of Congress, I was usually seated all the way at the end of the table, as far from the president as I could get. It was kind of like my house on major holidays. I was always seated, you know, at the junior table with the kids while all the adults had their meals. But that seating actually gave me a bird's eye view of what was happening in these meetings. So I was able to observe President Bush, and I was able to observe Vice President Cheney, the body language, the texture, the tone of these meetings. And obviously these were classified meetings, most of them. And obviously I couldn't write down what was said. But I would leave those meetings having heard some of the most, shall we say, unusual arguments, some bordering on the absurd, some heavily serious. I would leave these meetings and immediately go for my BlackBerry at the time and begin just writing my impressions of the meeting and writing certain things that I heard without disclosing anything that I cannot and would not disclose. And I had this concept. I said, my gosh, this stuff, it would make the most unbelievable book, except nobody would believe what was said. But I had this concept for a book about these meetings, except I had no story. Until August of 2006. I was a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I was sitting on that dais. And at a particular hearing in August of 2006, a major general came to address the Armed Services Committee in open session. And during that hearing, the general had to apologize for something that went wrong in U.S. surveillance of potential terrorists. Our surveillance strategies and systems and technologies picked up a tip that a group of people in Florida were planning a violent attack on the United States. And so we began listening to these people and watching these people. These people turned out to be a group of elderly Quakers. And they weren't planning an overthrow of the United States government. They were planning to put on pink T-shirts and get oak tag signs and parade in front of a military base protesting the war in Iraq. And the general said, essentially, oops, OOOPS, which I thought was a military acronym because everything's an acronym in the military. Like, what does that stand for? Oops, what is that? What agency is that? Well, we screwed up, is what it stood for. And that's when Morris Feldstein was born, right that day. Because it occurred to me, sitting on the dais, if it happened to this group of elderly Quakers, it's got to be happening to other people. Now remember, this is before the disclosure of the NSA surveillance system. This is before anybody knew what was going on. And so that day, Morris Feldstein was born. This hapless guy in Great Neck, New York, whose entire philosophy of life is don't make waves. He's the only guy I know who, when he gets on a plane, he would never put his recliner back because that would make waves for the person in